In 2017, two young friends from Germany were looking for an authentic canoeing adventure in the Canadian wilderness. The plan was to paddle a remote part of northern Manitoba, where the typical terrain varies from brush to muskeg to rivers and lakes, areas ripe with insects and hordes of mosquitoes and black flies. 10 days into their month-long paddling adventure, disaster struck as their canoe was wrecked on an extreme set of rapids. They were hundreds of kilometers from the closest town with no way to contact anyone in an emergency. This is the story of Wolf Wagner and John Hunch. So if you like what you see here and the stories that I share, consider subscribing and hitting that like button. And hit that notification button as well so you know every time I upload a new adventure gone wrong. So I recently asked you to vote on which story you wanted to see next, and this was the winner. Thanks everyone for voting. Wolf and John were two friends in their mid-20s from Dresden, Germany. They had a lust for adventure and had a variety of adventures under their belts. In 2016, they sailed together in Croatia and had such a good time, they were soon looking for their next adventure. But they weren't really sure where exactly they wanted to go, so they picked up a globe and just started spinning it and put their finger down and saw Canada on the map. And the one thing that stuck out to them in Canada was this big lake in the middle of Canada almost, called Lake Winnipeg. So they looked up from Lake Winnipeg and they saw the mighty Hudson's Bay and thought, hey, Lake Winnipeg to Hudson's Bay might be a pretty good trip. And what connects those two, Hudson's Bay and Lake Winnipeg, is a river called the Hayes River. Now, the Hayes River is a Canadian classic. It's a principal artery of the fur trade and is now considered a canoe tripping rite of passage. It stretches 610 kilometers across Manitoba. Now, this whole trip is a long trip. It's through super isolated wilderness that requires experience, the right kind of boat, and the right kind of gear. It's about a 22 to 28 day trip and one of the most isolated multi-day trips in Manitoba. And the first thing that they needed in Winnipeg was a canoe. So they were going to buy one online and they checked out some buy and sell sites in Winnipeg and came across a canoe that a family was selling. Now this canoe was not your typical multi-day trip in the woods kind of canoe. It was more the paddle leisurely on a lake as a newbie kind of canoe. They meticulously planned what they would bring. They each had 2 backpacks with clothes, 2 pairs of shoes each, maps for navigation, sleeping bags, tents, 1 tent, tools, a repair kit for the canoe, 2 stoves, and lots of miscellaneous outdoor equipment. And they did have emergency equipment, which included a GPS device and backup maps. And they did have their cell phones, but of course there'd be no cell service in this area. Going into it, they thought they were pretty prepared with their outdoors experience and previous canoe experience, so they were ready to take on the Hayes. So they got to the starting point on July 19th and packed all of their gear into the canoe, which they quickly realized did not have a lot of extra space once all their gear was in there. John sat in it, and this was the first time he realized how small the canoe was. There was very little leg room for him as he sat in the bow. So they set off on their first Canadian adventure. It was a beautiful midsummer day with little wind, and they thought that it was just a perfect day to start off on their trip. If you've ever been in a bushy, muskeggy area, you know the mosquitoes are absolutely brutal. Every night when they retreated to the bush to set up camp, they were just attacked by mosquitoes and black flies and other flying insects all night. They had no idea that the mosquitoes could ever be that bad, and they had never experienced anything quite like it. They were able to knock off about 35 kilometers a day, and a lot of the route had many portages, so that was going overland with the canoe and all their gear. And people end up usually carrying their boats across these portages, but instead of carrying this delicate canoe, they pushed it along the ground with their gear in it, which turned out to be a really bad idea. The dragging scraped holes into the bottom of this very thin canoe. When they saw it, they were mortified, but they did have their repair kit, so they were able to patch it up as they went along. As this happened, they were near their food resupply location called Oxford House. Oxford House is home to a First Nations Cree community and has a population of a couple thousand people. So at this point, with that compromised canoe, they were in civilization and they had a way out. But the condition of their canoe didn't really seem to alarm them, and what they had ahead of them was going to be even more remote and isolating. The Hayes River has 45 sets of rapids, 2 of which are unrunnable, so paddlers will always make their way around them through the trails. So John and Wolf made their way through this first set of rapids, and it was a little bit of a wild ride. They ended up smashing into a rock, and it took a chunk out of their boat, and then they landed and were able to assess the boat, and they saw this huge hole, bigger than a fist, that had come out of the canoe. And the hole didn't actually go into the boat, into the bottom of the boat, rather it just took kind of a chunk of foam out of the front of the boat. So they decided that it wasn't that bad and that they didn't have a way to fix it anyways after they used up almost all of their repair kit earlier. On day 11 of their trip, they started out and immediately went through more rapids, which they made through okay, even with their slightly damaged boat, which is kind of amazing. Then they came upon one of the 2 sets of unrunnable rapids. They knew that it was one that people portaged over, so they looked around for the trail, but they couldn't find anything. In all the other portages they got to, they found the trails really easily, but not this time. They actually walked with the boat for a little bit because although the current was strong, the river was really shallow. So they just kind of eased down the river a little bit. And then the rapids got more and more difficult, and it got deeper, and then the waves started. And they hit like 1 meter waves, and nothing but white water around them. And at that point, they were stuck on this rocky ledge. On one side of them was the river raging, on the other side was the river raging, and they just had nowhere to go. So they thought they had 2 options: letting the boat go ahead of them with their gear and with them swimming or walking behind, or 2, to go through the rapids in the canoe. And they decided on going down in the canoe because that just seemed safer for their own bodies. So they hopped in the boat, but that boat was now stuck on these rapids. The power of the water ended up turning it sideways, and the water was just smashing up against it. It was getting scraped on the rocks, and with their weight on it, it was being pushed into the rocks even more, and it was getting pummeled by the powerful water that they thought the canoe was getting compromised. They actually heard cracking and thought that it might crack in half. It was like sounding so bad. And they were worried that was going to happen. The canoe was just going to snap in half and all their gear would go down the river. But luckily, they managed to actually paddle it carefully to shore as it filled with water. They just kind of eased into shore. So they didn't have to go down those rapids, but they turned the boat over and saw that there was this large crack right in the middle of the boat. It was too damaged to be fixed, and they still had 35 rapids to go. Without a repaired boat, they knew that they wouldn't make it. So they just kind of stood around and looked at the state of the canoe on shore and tried to figure out what to do. Was there any other options? And then they came to this grim realization that their boat was broken beyond repair. Their adventures had now become a survival test. They were far away from civilization, the canoe was destroyed, and they had no way out. They faced a really tough decision. Do they wait for help? Maybe some other paddlers are going to come down the river, although it's a pretty remote river with not a lot of paddlers. Or do they try and just walk out? And they had no way to contact anyone in an emergency. They didn't have a satellite phone, a personal locator beacon, or cell services. They wanted to just sleep on it overnight and decide what to do in the morning. So after a restless night of sleep, morning came and they decided that their best option was just to walk out. Now this wasn't an easy decision to make. It was 115 kilometers overland to Gillam, Manitoba. They estimated that it would take 4 to 5 days to walk to Gillam, covering about 15 to 20 kilometers a day. But the 2 men were not familiar with the landscape of northern Manitoba. This area is, like I said earlier, is full of muskeg, which is a mix of water and rotting vegetation covered with a layer of sphagnum and other mosses. If you haven't ever had to walk through muskeg, consider yourself lucky. It's horrible to walk in. It's saturated ground, so it's super soft and difficult to navigate through. Anytime you step in it, your foot will go sink in, and it might go in a few centimeters, it might go in 2 feet, you might be up to your knees or your hips, and then you have to pick your leg up again and then keep climbing through it. And then there's the bugs on top of that. It just is a total nightmare. And it's not just the insects, it's not just the muskeg and spongy rotting vegetation, it's also the animals. This area is home to black bears, moose, caribou, and yes, even that big pesky white bear I talked about in another story, the polar bear. Polar bears in Manitoba are usually seen near the coast in and around the Churchill area, but they have been known to come south of that. In 2010, a polar bear was seen 400 kilometers south of Churchill. This lone polar bear was seen near the community of Shamatawa. I hope I said that right. If I didn't, I apologize. But that's in northern Manitoba. And as you can see from the map, that community is pretty darn close to the Hayes River where these 2 were. So the chances of Wolf and John running into a polar bear, while rare, was not impossible. And it's something that I would not stop thinking about if I was going to bushwhack my way 115 kilometers through the bushes. That's all I would be thinking about. And one report that I read in doing the research for this said that the Hayes is a remote wilderness river where you're as likely to see a polar bear as you are to see another human. So it doesn't get more terrifying than that. Luckily, their GPS and the navigation gear had survived the crash, so they knew which way to go, and they were pretty skilled in reading maps and trying to figure out the route that they wanted to take. They abandoned most of their gear so they didn't have to carry too much, and then they headed out into the bush. But they took their life jackets, backpacks, rain jackets, boots, gloves, mosquito spray, GPS, one paddle, a tarp, and their camp stove. They left a note on their canoe saying, "Unfortunately, we broke our canoe and the Hudson's Bay, our goal, is not reachable for us anymore. Our emergency plan now is to walk through the forest to Gillam." So they started the long walk. After the very first day, they knew that they would not be able to make the 25 kilometers a day that they had hoped for. That first day, they walked 6 kilometers in 8 hours. They didn't expect the swampy, wet-covered ground and multiple lakes and rivers that they had to forge through. They had to go through like 2 to 3 lakes and rivers every day. As they came to another body of water, they had this exhausting ritual, and that was to take off their life jackets and shirts, and so the mosquitoes would be all around them, and then they had to jump in the water fast so they couldn't bite them too much, and then they'd pile their shoes and socks and clothing on top of the raft that they built out of wood and push it while they swam across it. And these were some pretty big river and lake crossings that they had to go through. Then they hit an area that was burned by wildfires, and there were downed, burned trees all over. If you haven't seen a burned area, it's really nasty to walk through. There's just trees on top of trees and branches everywhere. It's not fun to walk through. They felt that this was the most dangerous part of the walk because if they fell here, they could get injured really badly. And the muskeg was so deep in spots, John, who was usually in the lead, got stuck numerous times, and Wolf had to come and actually pluck him out of the muskeg. And at the end of one of the longer swims, Wolf took a nasty fall into his hip as he emerged from the lake. He felt some pretty heavy pain and was initially worried that he broke his hip. But luckily, he was able to walk on it, and then it slowly got better. And that kind of hit home to them just how serious an injury would be in that area. It could be the difference between life and death. So after a few days, the hardest part for them became staying focused and not losing sanity. Wolf said both of us had moments when one of us would sit down and tell the other, "I'm not going any further." They were just so exhausted. He said we basically gave up on life. We had to motivate each other 20 or 30 times a day just to keep going. And they had to focus on just putting one foot in front of the other as they walked. They barely spoke because they were just too exhausted. As they plodded along, their feet were never dry. They would take off their boots every night, but every morning they had to put on wet and sometimes icy shoes. It was that cold. And they'd walk from 6 in the morning until 8 at night, and their feet were just sore and painful from all the walking. But food-wise, they were doing okay. They were able to salvage the majority of their food, and they had to ration it just because they knew they were going slower than they thought they would. They'd have 2 pieces of bread for breakfast, pack up the gear, and walk. Lunch would be another 2 pieces of bread, and for supper, a tasty can of hot soup. Wolf said, "We always thought about 2 things when we walked. The first thing was a pizza, and the second was getting back to our girlfriends." After they made it halfway, every step actually became easier. They started getting super excited about how close they were getting. They knew that the road was coming soon. And at this point, they knew they could do it. Day after day, they followed their GPS, and finally, after 10 days, they saw they were getting close to Gillam. They heard a car finally, vehicles on the road was close. Their goal of the last 11 days was finally met, and they finally reached that dang road. Wolf said hearing vehicles was like salvation. They popped out from the woods into the road and expected the first vehicle to pick them up and whisk them off to pizza and beer. But that didn't happen. They tried to hitchhike, and the first 4 or 5 cars sped by. I mean, could you imagine stopping to pick up these weird guys who are covered in cuts and bruises and bug bites and wearing life jackets and carrying a paddle? It must have just looked a little bit crazy for the locals to pick them up. But eventually a truck driven by a man who worked for Manitoba Hydro stopped and picked them up. Aaron Schnell was his name, and at first he thought that their story was too outlandish to be believable. But after seeing how bug-bitten and weathered they looked, along with those German accents, he knew that they were telling the truth. Aaron took them to a hotel where they were finally able to have long showers to get off all that grime. And then they joined Aaron for a beer and pizza. They had more than just a canoe adventure in the Canadian wilderness. They ended up having this crazy story of surviving in the bush. They ended up making their bus on time and the flights on time and headed back home with this unbelievable story to tell. They took that lone paddle back to Germany, split it in half, and each kept a part of their adventure of a lifetime. Wolf and John had this incredible experience and now share this strong bond because of it. They relied on each other to get through the harrowing ordeal, and they now know that they can rely on each other for anything. It's almost like they have this bond that's just so strong they can't even put it into words how strong the connection is. But they do know that it's brought them closer than ever. So it's a good story overall. In the end, they turned out okay. They survived, and they both realized how lucky they were to get out of that situation without serious harm. They both realized that they didn't have the adequate training for their trip, and they didn't plan it as much as they should have. They also should have had those key emergency devices, which I'll talk about in a second. At least they had those navigation skills, and that's what really carried them to the end, along with their motivation and will to just keep going and survive. So what lessons can we learn from this? This is always good to talk about at the end. So there was a Saskatchewan paddler who went down the Hayes River after these guys, and his name is Scott Robertson. He came across the abandoned canoe when he and his partner were out paddling the Hayes River. He said that Wolf and John were neither prepared nor properly equipped to paddle the rocky northern Manitoba waterway. He said they get a feather in their cap for surviving because to walk 10 days through muskeg is no small feat. Robertson had been paddling for 40 years and said that he always wanted to do the Hayes River. But he and his paddling partner spent the last 4 days of their trip worrying about the fate of the two men who left behind the damaged canoe. There was also a backpack that had been torn open by a black bear, and then they saw that note, which had been tattered by then, about their predicament on the rapids. So they were pretty worried about them the whole way. And Scott talked about the fiberglass boat that they came across. He said it had a folded keel, suitable for a day paddle on a placid pond. Most paddlers traverse the Hayes in boats made of the hard ABS plastic or composite materials. The keel wasn't even solid, so as you ground off 1/8 of an inch of fiberglass, your boat is now leaking over its full 17-foot length. And as for emergency devices, he says he always travels with a satellite phone and personal locator beacon, which is a GPS-enabled device that allows stranded or wounded travelers to just trigger a search response with a push of a button. Dave McDonald, who is the president and lead instructor at the International Canadian School of Survival, echoed Scott's advice. He said, "I always carry a personal locator beacon and highly recommend that everyone does. Go prepared, go with some survival equipment, and have a means of communication if you need rescue." McDonald nonetheless praised the Germans for at least packing a map, compass, and GPS, and for possessing the skills to use those tools to travel to Gillam. So that's a story of Wolf and John. Glad they made it out alive, and we have a happy ending this time. Thanks for watching.